Hi, I'm Mike Fleming.
And I am Barb Chose.
And this is the Finding Healthy Church podcast. This is a podcast where we talk about the practical execution of God's purpose and plan in the world. The first thing we're talking about right now is, what is his purpose and plan? What does it mean to execute it well? And that's really what Finding Healthy Church is all about. So if that's appealing to you, which we think it should be if you're a Christian, right? Because we think the church is the master plan, right? What God had in mind when he created, then this is a podcast for you. This is a podcast for those kind of people.
We need to understand why it is an important piece of our life in Jesus, how we live it out.
Yeah. So in the last episode, we talked about unity or oneness because so far we've been leapfrogging off of the concept that God is an eternal community of love. We've been talking about the implications of that. And in the last episode, we talked about how oneness is determined by location. So Jesus talked about being in the Father, and the Father was in him a lot. So there's this location thing going on where location has a lot to do with unity. And God has always built things to dwell in, right? So from the Old Testament, you can see pictures or shadows of this with the ark and the tabernacle and the temple, but those were all shadows or pictures of really what the original purpose was in Genesis, which is for mankind to be the temple. And what we find in the New Testament, it says that we are the temple that God has built to dwell in. But the problem with that is we're only a temple if we're built together. Peter talked about us being living stones that are built up as a spiritual house. The implication of that is that if we're not built up, we're just a pile of stones, right? We're just laying there, scattered, isolated in a pile, and there's nothing for God to dwell in. So it takes this building together in community for God's presence to come and dwell in and work through.
Yeah, there's the image is pretty much anti-independence in one sense, a lot more about interdependence, especially if you are to be built together or if you are going to go from just being a stone to being part of a bedrock or you're connected to other stones. So there's an interdependence. My part holds up one stone and there's another stone that holds me and keeps me in place. So there's a real play there's a real understanding that it's about interdependent relationships that's required to be a real Christian, someone who's really trying to live out their faith.
And so if that's the case, if we need to be built together, we talked about just the fact that that's what we needed in the last episode. So in this episode, we want to talk about some practical ways in which Christians become built together. We got 6 of them we're going to share in this episode. It's not all of them necessarily, but we think these are 6 solid ones. So let's get started. So number 1 is we're built together by a shared life. The corporate life of God, it's only expressed through a community. That's who he is. He's not an individual. And so community is only made possible by a shared life. And we find in the New Testament that the number 1 picture for healthy shared life for the church in the New Testament is the family. So what do families do? They share life together. At least healthy families do, right?
Right.
And so if we think about all the things that healthy families do, this is the same kind of thing, that same kind of connectedness that builds his church together as well.
Right. Well, when you think about just biological families, the biological families that are usually more intimate and are connected relationally, much more so when they're physically actually closer to one another. It's not to say that I don't have an intimate relationship with my daughter who lives, 500 miles away. But if she were living here, we would have much more access to one another. We'd be able to take care of each other's needs, and we'd be able to participate in celebrations much more in reality because we're physically close to one another. When we have that image, we can all identify that image. But I think what we have to remember is, Jesus makes it really clear in the scriptures, Matthew in Matthew 12, he talks about a situation where Jesus's mother and brothers are waiting out, looking for him, and they're saying, hey, we want to talk to him. And Jesus says, well, who is my mother and who is my brother? And he says, those who do the will of my Father in heaven. So it seems that those of us who are in Christ need to sort of maybe expand our inclusion of what we see as family and who else should be included in our family identity, just past the biological family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he talked about even God is radical, as saying if you don't leave your father and mother and sister and brothers and family for the sake of the gospel, you're not worthy of me. That was very interesting. But you touched on a really good point. I think one of the key ingredients of having a shared life is distance, right? And it's not rocket science, right? We've all experienced it. We might have a really, really, really close friend. Like I know my wife has a really, really close college friend, and now they live far apart and they're just not as close. And it's not because they love each other less. Right. It's not because of anything like that.
Right.
And so like in a case where, you might go to church with people that, and they're, let's say they're a 20-minute drive away from you, right? But you meet at the same building. That's going to be really difficult, right? Like, it's not that you can't have some level of shared life. You can stay connected in different ways. Or you can plan meetings, but a lot of spontaneity, a lot of things that you would do if you live closer that you don't do because you don't live closer.
Yep.
Those are real big obstacles. And typically you don't really have close-knit. I'll call it close-knit shared life, close-knit community with those that are far away.
Right. You don't have that kind of connection. In fact, I'll tell you, when we started our congregation years ago, back in 1978, we had a couple of families that lived quite a distance, probably, I would say, half an hour to 45 minutes traffic travel time and things like that. And so
which in LA is like 1 mile, right?
You're right. Well, not quite, but still, you're driving through downtown LA. But the issue was, as we met for a year and trying to figure out what are we going to look like? How are we going to be together? And so what we did was once a week, all of us that lived in actually closer to one another would travel up that way to be there for Bible study. And then they would travel down our way, once or twice a week, just to be around and to be part of gatherings and things like that. And eventually, after a year, they decided, we all said, no, we just got to be close. So they sold what they had, their house, and bought another house right down the street. And we all sort of, engaged and said, well, we need to be at least 10 minutes walking distance from one another, maybe driving. And that changed our togetherness because we were able to take care of each other so much more. And we all had children at the time, and we were able to do childcare together and, help each other out and things like that. And, some of it also affects our neighborhood because they see us walking back and forth. They see us next door, especially now. The congregation that's there now just has a much bigger, not influence, but people know, and we get to meet them and they get to kind of engage, and stuff. And they know that we take care of one another, which there's like amazed,
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay. Number 2, we're built together by fellowship. A little bit of clarification on what we mean by fellowship. It's not having potluck dinners. That's how I grew up understanding fellowship is like, come, let's eat together and have fellowship. It's not that you don't have a level of fellowship at a potluck dinner. I certainly did. But the Greek word for fellowship really means all the things we've been talking about. So sharing in common, partnership, mutual participation, sharing life, those types of things.
Yeah, being able to meet each other's needs, meals, sharing meals with one another. And those are things that are very, important. And Acts, and I think when you look at the example of Acts 2:41 through 47, that was the initial response to the gospel. And the rest of the New Testament is the works, of those who were the first fruits. who encouraged and exhorted and taught about the essential things, about the things that what Jesus came and taught, which is about sharing life. And so what happened, when they responded to Peter's call, they repented, were baptized, and then what did they do? They shared life. There were tons of Jews that were from out of town in Jerusalem for Pentecost, and they took care of their needs. People who had sold what they didn't need to help those who had need, and they just took care of one another. They prayed together. They ate together. They shared the Lord's Supper together. So it would seem like they set the example of what it ought to look like. And somewhere along the line, as a lot of things sort of got down to a place where it's become not so much that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And this Greek word for fellowship, meaning like partnership or mutual participation, I think a lot of Christian experience or church experience, we see an imbalance with those things. So some people, they say like 20% of the people do 80% of the work, that occurs a lot in churches. So that's really the opposite of fellowship, is this idea that, some people do the work and everyone else receives or gets fed, and that's a whole bunny trail we could go down. But the point being that there's this equality or mutuality in participation and ownership and partnership of what's going on in your shared life together. That is at the root of fellowship, because that's the life of the Godhead. That's the fellowship. The fellowship of the Godhead is their life.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Them coexisting and their mutual participation with each other and their partnering with each other is their life. And so to be built up into Christ together, to be built together, is to increasingly experience that fellowship that they're having with other human beings.
Right. It's learning to take in the vertical relationship of God to us and living it out horizontally. We always talk about how does God shine in sideways through one another? And that's what his expectation is he wants us to also shine sideways, to take what we get vertically and to shine it in sideways to one another, to be his representatives or his life, to others.
Okay, number 3, we're built together by working together. No person within the Godhead thinks or acts individualistically. They think and act together. Mm-hmm. In a previous episode, we talked about how modern day ministry is a lot about individuals. It's a lot about individuals and their spiritual gifts building their own little kingdoms they can rule over. Mm-hmm. It's a lot about certain spiritual gifts being elevated above others. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot about, like I said previously, some people doing a lot of the work and some people doing a little or no work, to accomplish the mission.
Right.
Being built together is about one anothering as we work towards our common goals. We find in the New Testament this concept of one anothering.
Yep.
That everything is built on how we work together and do things for one another, whether that be encourage one another, carry one another's burdens, love one another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. Well, I have a list. We did a list a long time ago, and I have a list of like at least 73 specific one to another's that are in the New Testament. So, I can share that with folks through our website or through our site if they wanted, and do that. And people can at least look at that, and maybe they can add to it too. I know I've seen other sites where they've said they have listed 100. I haven't quite followed up to see what the other, 27 is that I don't know. Yeah. but anyway, 73 is quite a bit.
Well, it's all over the map. There's a book that we're probably going to get into soon called 58 to 0, 58 one another's. It's called 58 to 0 because the author believes there's 58 one another's. Mm-hmm. So it's all over the map. There's 58,
Yep.
maybe there's 72, maybe there's 100. I don't know. I
But
guess
there's
the
a
important
lot.
thing is, the important thing is it's a lot, and that's really what being built together is built on.
Yeah. And I think if people can sit and understand the reality of how those things are lived out, it is it's a beautiful thing. And you look at that. So one of the things that I know that is going on right now is the congregation that I was a part of just recently had a situation where one of their couples, she had a preemie, and it was unexpected, obviously. And they have no biological family here. Their family is the congregation that they have been a part of. And so once that was known, phone call was made, and one of the gals who has become sort of a grandma came over and took care of their eldest daughter, who's 3.5, and brought her over to spend time with her, and all the other needs got taken care of. And Dad was working a job where he wasn't getting paid for the time off, even though this was happening. And so the congregation got together and pulled together what they had individually, individual members, was not through a benevolence fund or anything like that, came together and helped take care of some of their financial needs so they didn't have to worry about it. And Mom was in the hospital for over a week or so. And during that time, all the different members of the congregation helped take care of their daughter and their things that needed to be done at home, and gave them the time to just deal with what they had to deal with their newly born infant, who is fine, by the way, and is home now.
That's good.
Imagine if you were not part of a people like that, and how difficult that would be.
Yeah. And I think most Christians, they want to step up to the plate in those types of situations. But it's like when you're not connected on a day-to-day basis, when serious things like that happen, or crisis or trauma happens, it becomes a little awkward, right?
Yep.
It's like a little awkward to like get involved.
Sure.
But when you are like a family, when you feel like a family,
When you've been living like that.
Yeah, when you've been living like that, then like, hey, I'll take your 4-year-old, and make sure, and not only but like, hey, we'll figure it out,
Yep.
and your 4-year-old is comfortable with everybody. And
Yep.
so like, this is going to be fine, right?
Yep.
Like,
Exactly.
you'll carry that burden with you. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Number 4, we're built together by giving and receiving. There's such a thing as possession within the Godhead. They don't all possess or co-possess everything at the same time. And we find in the scriptures, they possess different things at different times, but it's never exclusive. So ownership within the Godhead is not exclusive to the individual person, but rather it's community-based.
Right.
So each person, because there's possession, can be both a giver and a receiver.
Yep.
If there wasn't possession, it would take it totally out of that.
And I have been the recipient and the giver in situations like that. And the congregation that I was a part of, and even the congregation that I'm now a part of, that we're trying to build another community congregation. Exactly. That's kind of how we're fleshing out things. We give and we receive and take care of one another as each has need when they have need.
Yeah. And I think we find like individuals usually, they struggle with one more than another, and neither, sometimes people are more giving and they have trouble receiving. Sometimes people like to receive and have trouble giving. It varies, but in a close-knit community, you become more comfortable and you see that example, right, of giving and receiving and becoming both at the same time.
Right. And I think you actually can have, it becomes a more responsible and humbling response on either side, to be able, you're right. I think it's always easier to be the top dog and give and not have need. But the bottom line is we're all pretty needy in something one way or another. And I think it interferes with our relationship with God, really, if we become so self-dependent and self-reliant and independent. it kind of has a sense where we can also say we have no need for God because I can take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
But when we find ourselves in a needy place and others who love us come along and take care of us as we need, it is a humbling experience. So it is also a humbling experience when it's my turn to share life with somebody because I know what it feels like and I want to free them to enjoy the gift and that I get to give thanks that I get to share the gift.
Yeah. And it seems like life just balances things out, like in terms of this giving and receiving, because like you'll go through seasons where maybe you're more the giver because of a certain situation or another season where you're more the receiver. And like you said, it's not just financial, right? It's like the gifts you have, any resources you have, the time you have, the attention you have, the gifts you have, the skills you have, what you can offer, like they can all come into play at certain times or another to fill each other's needs. And essentially it's about the well-being of the community. Like, what does the community need right now? What do the people in the community need right now? And who's most fit to help in that area?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's, it's important to this idea of shared life because there's a responsibility to each individual to share. I think one of the things I know that some congregations have looked at what they call a common pot or a common purse, where everybody just kind of throws everything into one pot and then it gets evenly distributed out to each individual. And I feel like, we talked about it many years ago when we were trying to figure out what to do. And we decided that just kind of takes away from my having to deal with my sharing, that's a decision I need to come to process. It's one thing to say, okay, I can throw my money in. And so I don't have to worry about, because we're all getting the same amount of money and we're all getting the same amount. So we don't really have to take care of each other. There seems to be something that gets in the way of the felt experience of dealing with sharing.
Right. Yeah. And the first church did not have a common bank account. That's definitely a misconception.
Yeah.
Because like we said, there must be possession for there to be giving.
Barnabas, right? That's what he did. He sold everything he had and brought it to the apostles for them to distribute as people had need. But he was the one that did it, and no one else was required to do that,
Yeah. So he had the same attitude, like when we talked about the person in God, I possess this, but I don't own it.
Yep.
Right? The ownership is the community's.
Yep.
I possess it and I'm able to give it. Right. And you possess something else and you're able to give it. And so when you find this like giving and receiving, it just, back to our theme for this episode, this giving and receiving activity that is supposed to be constant and equal and shared, it just builds us together in love and like a family. I think personally, one of the biggest obstacles today to churches being people in churches being built together is the collection and distribution of money by church organizations. So exactly what you're saying. Hey, give your, whatever you're going to give for the work of God, give it to this organization. We're going to throw it into this bank account, this budget, and then we are going to decide, some specially chosen people are going to get together and decide what to do with it. And we call that the work of the ministry, and you should give to the work of the ministry because God wants you to, or whatever, whatever the justification is, or
right.
And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that's wrong. What I'm saying, it's an obstacle to Christians being built together because giving and receiving is an essential part of the human relationship. And when you remove that essential part of the human relationship, you remove the opportunity for that relationship to be built. And so that's why we have such weak relationships, relatively speaking, kind of weak relationships in churches that don't feel like families. They might feel like social clubs. They might feel like close friends, but they don't feel like families because there isn't this like, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. The community owns it. I just possess it sort of attitude.
Right. And not just with money, but with problems, with struggles that you're going through. I think sometimes You don't. And that's the unfortunate part. You know, you don't know where you might be able to be a gift because there isn't the opportunity for those things to be known because there isn't, the relationships are so, I would say, superficial in one sense. And so it does create a shallowness, which I think doesn't afford the real reality and closeness of family life.
Yeah. And so just want to say, I'm not saying that it's wrong or bad to give to a church organization for a specific purpose or a parachurch organization or a worthy cause. Not saying that.
Right.
More just saying, like, since this is a podcast about, healthy church,
right,
and being built together, are we still, like, is that the only giving we're doing? And are we receiving from others? What is the activity of giving and receiving between you and your brothers and sisters in Christ? That's the main question.
Right.
Basically, we need to think about what are the obstacles to that and how do we address those,
Right.
So number five is we're built together by the cross. The cross becomes a symbol for basically the willingness to lay down your life. So when we talk about us carrying our cross daily, it's an expression of the life of God, willingness to live by sacrificial love. If we don't do that, we don't get built together. Just a bunch of selfish people walking around trying to get their own, live for their own interests. We don't get that. And so we're all familiar with, John 15:13, where Jesus said, no one has greater love than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. So when he says lay down his life, he means the soul life, like the mind, will, and emotions. So basically, like I said, giving up our own interest for the good of another. To take it a step further, giving up our own interests for the good of the group, for the good of the community, for the good of the church.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, we need to understand that we are just selfish people in a lot of ways. And we always, when we try to engage, like somebody has a need, we want to go, okay, how can I take care of the situation without sacrificing my day off? I would just use that for an example. You think that way because you feel like, and you have to struggle with to say no. And it's kind of like the situation that I was talking about down south of this congregation where people had to, they obviously, of course, I'm going to help take care of your daughter. I'm going to put aside what I was planning to do. And because I want to love you and care about you. And some people, some of the folks down there gave up their vacation plans. They had plans to go on vacation for the weekend. And because of the situation that went on, they just said, we can't go. We got to stay and help where we can. And so the vacation to have a reunion with other people, friends and people who are part of the congregation, of which I was part, we said, of course, you've got to stay. And then I said, of course, I've got to come and see how I can help too, because I am intimately attached to the folks there. So, I paid the bucks to fly down there and be a part of them and see what kind of help is needed and come alongside. And so I think it is that. And what did I give up? Well, I gave up time with you to do our podcast and other things that I was planning to enjoy up here, to say, I can't do that. I planned to see my kids, my daughter and grandkids, and said, I can't come. I got to go take care of this situation. And they obviously knew that was a priority and were gracious enough to say, yeah, you got to go do that,
Yeah.
So, yeah, but that doesn't happen very often. I think a lot of us are just afraid to be needy again. Live in the reality that we are needy, and that is who we are. And it's okay. And it's okay.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
In fact, Watchman Nee says that independence and self-reliance are the enemy of reliance and dependence on God.
Yeah, I think we talked about that being like the root of the garden choice when the snake comes to Eve and says, you can be independent and decide for yourself what's good and evil. And she's like, ooh, that sounds tasty. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Instead of being reliant on God's life. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Number 6. Last one. Save the most controversial for last. We're built together by shared leadership. So, authority in God, it's corporate. It's invested in all the persons within God. And so authority in Christ's body is the same. It's corporate. It's invested in all the members of his body. The New Testament clearly teaches Christ is the head of the church. And so he alone is the leader through all of its parts. And not only that, but Christ is made up of both head and body. It's Christ the head, Christ the body. And so he makes all the decisions. We struggle a lot with this one because the only way he can make the decisions is if the leadership is shared among the body. Going back to your point about being needy, I think there's a point about not only being needy, but being suspicious of ourselves and being humble that, hey, I don't have like a direct telephone line to God that's like way, way more in tune than what the body's connection to the head is. We humans struggle so much with this one, I think. This concept that we are a body that's connected to a head that needs to hear from the head together, that he can only make decisions by communicating with the body, and that if one of the arms is going right and the other's going left, one of you is not hearing right, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, you can damage your body when two parts are going opposite directions.
Yeah.
I'm picturing like myself doing the splits, and what would that do to me? I would be injured for sure.
I know. Yeah. Well, I think we forget that authority is given. It's not taken. In other words, whether it's Jesus that gives us the authority, the body, the authority to live out life as he would want it. So he's given that to the body. And it's not, I don't, as a hand, say, okay, I'm going to take it. I'm going to decide. No, it's something that the body has to work together to discern what the gifts are, and what the uses are, and how to help the body be fully who it needs to be. And so it's within the body that the gifts and our parts are discerned. And if you are the hand and I am the elbow, I may need to follow your lead as to how to grab something. If I don't follow your lead, like you said, I could mess up my shoulder. Yeah. And so I think there is an understanding of leadership as being something that is given for the whole of the congregation, for the whole of the body to work as it should.
To your point about authority being given, it's not just given, but it's not given to a person.
Right.
It's given to the truth.
Right.
So if a person is bringing the truth in a situation, then you have authority.
Right.
If someone I really respect, is a mentor to me, if they are wrong about something, they don't have authority. They are sinful about something, they don't have authority. And so one of the most unhealthy things that can enter into a church is when authority is locked into a person or a position. Once that happens, it's a death sentence. The health of that body will be not good. So I want to share a quote from the book we've been referencing a lot in our conversations recently, which is The Community Life of God. And he talks about leadership and authority. And he says this: life flows within God like a liquid, like a river. Everything about God is contained within the water of this river. The liquid is his life. It's who he is and what he does. Authority and leadership is just another part of his life. It flows like the rest of his life flows. We can only think inside of a certain box that we call leadership. But God's life is fluid. It flows and changes according to the need. The essence of who he is does not change. However, the way that he moves and does things does change. The essential composition and nature of water never changes. However, water is fluid, and it flows and changes shape and form to fit the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you said, Barb, God's Spirit, through the gifts he gives to people, works through different people at different times and in different situations to lead.
Yes.
And if we're not open to that, we become very unhealthy. If that's not how we operate on a day-to-day,
Right.
if authority and leadership gets locked into a person or position, we become very unhealthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right.
So I want to wrap up. There's 6 ways to be built together. Number 1, we're built together by shared life. Number 2, we're built together by fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, we're built together by working together. Number 4, we're built together by giving and receiving.
Mm-hmm.
Number 5, we're built together by the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And number 6, we're built together by shared leadership. Again, not a comprehensive list, but a good start, I think.
Yeah.
If you can nail these down, you'll be on your way to being built into a healthy group of people.
Yep.
Okay, so
Right.
if you have any questions about this or any other episode, you can email us at Mike, M-I-K-E, at findinghealthychurch.com. You can subscribe there for updates to our email newsletter, get other resources, and we'll see you next time.
Did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try but coming up with these inventions? Do you know why? Did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try?
Thanks for listening to the show. If what you heard was helpful, hit the subscribe button and notification bell. Leave us a comment and check out these other episodes.